So, we had just finished talking about virulence factors and how we can actually use these virulence factors to our advantage to help us identify organisms in the lab. And so, we are going to be looking at these virulence factors that will help us identify different staph and strep species. And since we have so much staph and strep on us, I wanted to take a moment to just kind of introduce some of these diseases and some of these organisms that we will be seeing in lab. So, there are some upper respiratory tract infections that can actually be caused by things like staph epidermidis, that we affectionately call staph epi, Staph aureus, and then Carini bacteria, which unfortunately we're not going to be seeing in lab. So, pharyngitis, this is caused by streptococcus. So, if you have a strep throat, this can be spread from person to person. People usually get chills, fever, headache, very sore throat, almost feels like pins and needles in the throat. And of course, it's diagnosed through that dreaded throat culture where they take that swab and basically, try to swab your toes from your throat to try to get a sample. I know that when my kids have had strep throat, it's also been accompanied by stomach aches. So anytime that my son complained about a really bad sore throat and a stomach ache, I said, "Yeah, you know what? Maybe we better go to the doctor and have a strep check." Sinusitis, sinus infections can be caused by a number of different organisms, Staph aureus, strep pneumonia, strep pyogenes. So when you get that lack of drainage and everything is just kind of compacted, that's going to be a good environment for bacteria to flourish. And so usually people will have to go on antibiotics. My son, when he was younger, was very prone to sinus infections, so he was on antibiotics a lot trying to treat them. Bronchitis, so this can also be caused by some different organisms like strep pneumonia and staph. Again, if it spreads to the lungs, remember that's when now we term it pneumonia. So there can also be some skin diseases that are caused by staph and strep. So pyoderma, so this can be caused by staph, strep, or Carini bacteria. So things like impetigo that kids can get, this is highly contagious. I'll show you a picture so that you can see this. Um, it can be treated with antibiotics. Staph can cause a number of skin disorders like a pimple, a sty. So if you've ever gotten a little bump at the base of your eyelash, it feels like a boulder, but even though it's very, very small, that can be caused by staph. An abscess, this is going to be much larger. A furuncle or a boil, this is going to be an external abscess. I'll be talking a little bit about when I got the chickenpox as we talk about the progression of disease. And when I went originally to a hospital, they misdiagnosed me. And I was talking about this chickenpox that I didn't know at the time what that was. And I was asking, what is this thing? And he said, oh, that's what we call a hairy uncle. And I was like, what on earth is a hairy uncle? I think what he was talking about was this furuncle where he thought it was an external abscess. Yeah, wrong. It was actually the chicken pox. Carbuncles, these are going to be massive skin lesions, and scalded skin syndrome, which can be very serious. This is actually caused by these exotoxins produced by particular strains of Staph aureus. This can be common in infants. It can produce really high fever and it can be very, very serious. So I do have some pictures here where you can see each of these different skin lesions. Some other staph and strep diseases. Strep agalactiae is also known as group B strep that we will be seeing in lab. This is a particular concern for pregnant women. So, pregnant women are usually checked around 37 weeks right before delivery, because if they test positive for this and the baby is born, it can lead to certain complications like meningitis and pneumonia. So when I was pregnant with my son, they tested me for group B strep and I was positive. So I had to go on antibiotics before he was born. Strep pyogenes, talked a little bit about that with strep throat. It can also cause scarlet fever. Now, this isn't all strains of strep pyogenes. This is a particular strain that's been infected with a temperate phage that allows them to produce this toxin, which is responsible for scarlet fever. So, I have known friends who had kids who their child had strep throat and then it ended up into scarlet fever. Of course, we can treat this with antibiotics. I know I'm aging myself by saying this, but my first introduction to scarlet fever was watching Little House on the Prairie. And I told you that my mother was a nurse. And so growing up, she thought I had everything under the sun. And I remember this one time I was sick and I had a rash, and she thought that it was scarlet fever. I was scared because what I remember was what I saw on Little House on the Prairie. And it was like, people die from that. So fortunately, we have antibiotics that treat it. I did not have scarlet fever, but I know I'm aging myself by saying that was my first introduction to strep pyogenes. So strep pneumonia can cause pneumonia and meningitis. Meningitis is the inflammation of the meninges that can put a lot of pressure on the brain. This is a very, very serious disease, especially if it's caused by a bacteria. And this is one of those things that you could be fine 1 minute and then 48 hours later, you could be dead. Recently, somebody was telling me about a friend of theirs who had meningitis, and it was actually caused by a sinus infection that had basically gone up and infected the meninges. They were very, very fortunate that they were able to recover, but they spent weeks in the hospital and basically had to relearn everything like how to walk. So, very, very serious illness. And then Staph aureus. We have a lot of Staph aureus on us. There is one particular strain, MRSA, which is drug resistant, that we are mostly concerned about. As I've said, it's not summer in our house unless somebody gets cellulitis. One summer, my husband got cellulitis, and they were pretty sure that it was actually caused by MRSA. So he was on some heavy duty drugs like vancomycin in the hospital for a couple of weeks. Another disease which is caused by a particular strain of Staph aureus is toxic shock syndrome. And this is only infection with certain strains. We usually hear about toxic shock syndrome. Warnings come on tampon boxes. And so they say, if those abrasive tampons are left in for a long period of time, now conditions for that bacteria to flourish. Some women may have this particular strain among their normal microflora. Only a fraction of these organisms will cause toxic shock syndrome. Males can also get toxic shock syndrome, but we mostly see warning signs on tampon boxes. So in lab, we will actually be working with staph and strep organisms and identifying them.